Carl Herzog with us today. He has this incredibly unique background in an area of history that some of us have had lives that have touched on it, maritime history, if we were in the Navy or if we were somehow connected with the Navy at some point in our careers. But he knows some of the history, as I mentioned before, of the very foundations of our American history and of our military history. Today he's going to talk to us about the USS Constitution, and at the very end of our programming we'll have an opportunity to ask him questions. So if there's things that you would like to ask him about or something related to maritime history that you think he might be able to help you learn more about, please ask those questions. Or if you have something to share about your own experience with the USS Constitution or with maritime history. I heard some really great discussion earlier today, just a couple minutes ago, and I think that that's really useful and valuable to all of us. Oh good, we have a couple more people coming in. So I'm going to let a couple people get settled and then we'll get started. And Carl, I'll just wait for a couple more people to get seated,
Sure.
And then I'll turn it over to you. So, okay? Great. Okay.
Let me get your chair, Jack. Is this okay for you?
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. We've just done our brief introduction, but right now I want to introduce everybody to Carl Herzog, who's our featured speaker for today. Thank you so much for coming today, and
thank you.
I can't wait to hear about your experiences, your understanding of the USS Constitution. Thank you for sharing that with all of us.
You're welcome. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. I really am honored by the opportunity to be here today and talk to you all about USS Constitution. As we were walking down the hall to come here, Sarah and I were talking about differences in service and the diverse nature of the veterans who are being served here at the hospital. And you also just mentioned talking about the foundations of American history. And today what I'm hoping to do with you as we talk about USS Constitution is to connect those ideas of diverse service with the foundations of history, American history, and in particular the U.S. Navy. So that's what I hope to give some indication. Just so I have a sense, we were talking earlier, one gentleman said he had visited USS Constitution in the past. Has anyone else actually had the opportunity to visit USS Constitution? Oh, okay, excellent, good, half of you. Well then, some of this may be familiar to you already, but otherwise I hope I have an opportunity to share some of the different ways that this particular ship has served the country.
Where is it, Charlestown?
Yeah, the ship is currently located in the Charlestown Navy Yard, where she's been since pretty much since about 1897. Yeah. I should say up front, I am not a veteran. I was not in the Navy. My background actually is in sailing ships akin to Constitution, smaller replica vessels that do educational work. And then I went back to school for history as well after decades working as a deck officer and educator on those kinds of vessels, and found myself here. Constitution is sort of unique in its story because it is still an active commissioned U.S. Navy warship. And as such, it is manned by U.S. Navy enlisted sailors and officers. There's currently a crew of about 70 Navy personnel. They come to the ship just the same way they would to any other ship in the U.S. Navy. In fact, nearly half of them come to USS Constitution directly out of boot camp as having enlisted in the Navy. This is the very first ship, not only in the Navy, but for some of them, the very first ship ever that they've set foot on.
Volunteer?
But, oh, absolutely, U.S. Navy, yep.
Volunteer to get on there.
So yeah, there's actually a fairly aggressive application process to find the billet for USS Constitution. You have to be willing and comfortable talking to the public, because those active duty Navy sailors are the ones who are meeting and engaging with about 500,000 tourists from around the world every year who come to tour that ship. And the second big criteria, in addition to talking to the public, is also not being afraid of heights. Because that active duty crew is in fact climbing up in the rigging and setting and furling the sails. In fact, in this photo, you can see them all standing out on main topsail yard there, furling a sail early in the morning. And they'll do that both at the dock and occasionally underway when the ship leaves the dock to tour the harbor. In addition to that U.S. Navy enlisted crew, though, Constitution is supported by an entire second division of the Navy, and that is the Navy's Naval History and Heritage Command Detachment Boston, which is a group of about 40 shipwrights and professional riggers, nearly all civilian, and they are solely responsible professionally long-term over maintaining the ship, its sails and rigging. And you can see them at the base of the ship in a recent dry docking restoration that went from 2015 to 2017. The other photo here is of the current commander, U.S. Navy Commander Nathaniel Schick. He has been on board and captain of Constitution for 2 years. He is about to depart actually this month, and he will be replaced by Commander John Benda, who is currently the executive officer on board the ship. We're very lucky in that regard too. So if I'm not in the Navy, who am I? I am actually with the USS Constitution Museum, which is located in the Navy Yard directly across the ship. The museum is an independent nonprofit that was established in the early 1970s to become a steward for all of the artifacts and objects associated with the history of the ship, and continue to maintain those and tell the ship stories. And we do that as well too out of this building directly across the yard from the ship. So if you should happen to come and visit Constitution, feel free to come across. It's that extra 200 feet across the Navy Yard, and you can participate in the museum. We have more than 2,000 artifacts and thousands of pages of archival material, including original ship's logbooks, journals of midshipmen, newspapers going back to the founding, and artwork going back to the founding of the ship. So here it is, a commissioned warship. Honestly, if we have to send this into duty at this point, we're probably in really deep trouble. It's a wooden warship with 70 guns, 24-pound cannons. Probably not going to do much. So why is the Navy still interested in maintaining this as a commissioned warship? What's the point? This is where the nature of the service that Constitution provides and that the Navy sailors are on board there provide. Constitution has been afloat and operating in one capacity or another for more than 220 years now. And that continuity has led to her current role as a keeper of the heritage of the United States Navy. The ship is best known for its victories in the War of 1812, but her story actually begins substantially before 1812 and lasts long after it. Today, she still, during the summertime, conducts turnaround cruises in Boston Harbor. This is her a few years back at a turnaround cruise off Castle Island at the outer end of Boston Harbor. She'll be doing that again this summer. She has not sailed under her own power since 2012. Previously, the last time she did that in earnest was in 1997 for her 200th anniversary. And prior to that was in the 1880s, believe it or not. The ship, if you're not familiar, was actually built right in the north end of Boston at what is today the U.S. Coast Guard base there in the north end, directly across the water from Charlestown where the ship still now sits. It was one of 6 ships that were commissioned and appropriated funding for as part of a Naval Armament Act in 1794 The Continental Navy that had started with the American Revolution kind of disbanded. It wasn't considered necessary by the nation. And it wasn't until American commerce was under threat in the Mediterranean from the Barbary states along the North African coast that the president convinced Congress that there was a need for the construction of a new set of Navy ships. 3 of the 6 ended up getting immediately built, including Constitution, built in Boston. When she launched, she was the largest ship ever built in the city of Boston. This is a modern painting done by a very historical oriented artist who does a lot of research. You can actually see up next to the U.S. flag in the background, Old North Church. She dwarfed most of what was there in town. In fact, the ship was so big that the ways, the ramp that it was constructed on, settled during its construction. And so when they went to launch it, it slid halfway down and stopped. It was stuck there. And they had to wait another month for the next lunar high tide for the water to be high enough to give it another shot. It took 3 tries over a month-long period for them to actually launch this thing in the first place. A kind of inauspicious start to what turned out to be a pretty auspicious career. The yard was privately owned at the time, but again, this is now the U.S. Coast Guard base. It's really wonderful to be in Charlestown with Constitution and be able to look over right at the place where the ship was launched more than 200 years ago. Her first role, as I mentioned, was to support the U.S. in the Mediterranean. That's why she was built. But that conflict was diplomatically sort of resolved for a short while before the ship was even finished construction. And so when she was first completed, the first place that she actually saw conflict was down in the Caribbean, and what became known as the quasi-war with France, a little dust-up with France over payments associated with the American Revolution and Americans' desire to continue trading with the neutral powers of both France and Britain, who were at war with each other. That lasted for a short while, and then she was back to the Barbary conflict along the North African coast. And it was there that this ship starts to establish itself as really a foundational sense of U.S. naval history. Under this guy on the right, Edward Preble. Edward Preble was leading a group of young officers in command of a squadron in the Mediterranean. That the officers were also young. They would later be called Preble's boys, but they are names that echo out now today through the U.S. Navy. He was in charge of men with names like Decatur, Hull, Bainbridge, Porter, and Lawrence, all of whom would go on to distinguish themselves in command in the U.S. Navy. Preble himself led the siege at Tripoli, as you can see a period painting there. Also made famous in organizing an attack to scuttle the USS Philadelphia that had been captured by the Tripolitans and was at risk of being put to use by them and sent back out to sea. And so in a daring raid Decatur led into the harbor, they set fire to the Philadelphia, managed to scuttle the ship, preventing the Tripolitans from taking control of it. But after all that, the ship's real claim to fame begins with the War of 1812, just a few years later. Isaac Hull, a young officer seen here in a Gilbert Stuart painting. By the way, most of everything that I'll show you is either part of the collection of the USS Constitution Museum or on display there on loan to the USS Constitution Museum. Isaac Hull took command before the War of 1812 actually even began, and when the war was declared against Britain. He was ordered to leave the Chesapeake. He was up in Washington, D.C., head out into the open sea and find and capture British shipping and defend that along the way. Well, he found the British really, really fast. Right off the coast of New Jersey, Isaac Hull ran into an entire British squadron. 5 ships overnight, all at once. he was outnumbered dramatically and realized he needed to live to fight another day, and so put on all sail, ready to flee. And that's when the wind died. The ship was stalled out. 5 ships behind him following were stalled out. The crew started doing everything they could to make this ship move and move faster than the British ships that were following it. They rowed. They put out the small boats, as you see in this painting, literally rowing Constitution, set all sails. They kedged, which was a process by which you set an anchor ahead of the vessel, a small anchor ahead of the vessel in a small boat, and then tow the ship to it, lift up the anchor, put it back in the small boat, row the small boat out, drop the anchor, haul the ship forward, literally clawing your way across the New Jersey seabed, trying to get away from the British. And then finally they saw a squall on the horizon, a storm that was likely to dust up. And so Hull sent his crew up into the rigging to reduce the amount of sail, because a heavy wind could take down the entire rig if too much sail was set. But it was all a ruse. The British saw him doing this, and then for their own safety, they too sent their crew up in to reduce sail. And as soon as Hull saw that the British were reducing sail for the squall, he set everything again. It was a risky venture that could have destroyed the entire ship by taking down the entire rig, but instead he bolted ahead, leaving them behind, and by the next day they were finally out of sight and had escaped from the British squadron. So he makes it up to Boston and then meets up with other ships and heads out again to capture British shipping. And it was there off of Nova Scotia that the first big battle that Constitution participates in, and her first real claim to fame occurs when she meets the HMS Guerriere, a British frigate off of Nova Scotia. This was a pure old-fashioned gunnery battle. One ship against the other. Constitution had the weather gauge, meaning it was upwind. They were able to bear down on Guerriere, charged right for them, got into position, were able to fire broadsides. The ships exchanged gunfire back and forth, and the practice, the skill that Hull had imbued in his band, and the guns, the larger number of guns of Constitution, defeated HMS Guerriere, eventually bringing down the entire rig of the British ship and leaving it in such a state of disrepair that even after Guerriere surrendered and the British Navy sent, or Americans, Hull sent Constitution crew over to see if they could salvage this vessel and use it for the U.S. Navy, it was in such horrible shape that they decided they had to scuttle it. And so they blew up the rest of Guerriere, sent her to the bottom, taking home the British crew as prisoners and winning this amazing victory. When Hull arrives back in Boston, he is treated to a hero's welcome as a result of this. This was a huge, huge turning point for the U.S. and the U.S. Navy, because they had defeated a ship of what had, up until that time, been recognized as the greatest navy in the world, the British Royal Navy. And this was shocking to both the Brits and to the Americans. And it was, you can't really overstate what a morale boost it was for the Americans. There in Boston, after the end of this battle, Hull leaves and Bainbridge takes command. Where Hull was a hero, Bainbridge was not quite so much a hero. Bainbridge had been on board Philadelphia when it was captured and had ended up in prison in Tripoli. He was largely not particularly well received for those incidents in the U.S. Navy, and when he takes command of Constitution, Bainbridge sees this as the personal opportunity for redemption for him to reclaim his naval career. And indeed he does. He sails off of, out into the Atlantic, again, transiting great distances, looking for that British shipping, all the way across the Atlantic, and then turning back toward the Americas, toward the coast of Brazil. I like these maps and images of both the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the South Atlantic, because I think it provides a sense of the breadth of U.S. naval operations very early on in our nation's history. I think the general public often has this sense that the concepts of sort of forward deployment and power projection and sending ships out to protect U.S. interests around the world is a largely post-World War II phenomenon. But indeed, from the beginning, the U.S. Navy goal, and the guise of Constitution and these other ships, was to sail the world's oceans and protect U.S. shipping and defeat what was at the time British enemy shipping. And they're off of, when they arrive in Brazil in company with USS Hornet, Bainbridge is going to stop at Fernando de Novo, a Portuguese penal colony off the coast of Brazil. And there he decides he wants to leave a message for David Porter on the USS Essex. Porter is somewhere out there also in the Atlantic, but Bainbridge doesn't know exactly where. He's hoping to meet up with Porter. But he also doesn't want to tip his hand that the Americans are now in the South Atlantic. So when they arrive at Fernando, they pose as British ships and British naval officers, come ashore, introduce themselves as such, and then leave a message to be given to Porter should he arrive, all of them having assumed fake British Navy ship and naval officers' names. And he writes a letter to Porter saying, "Oh, we're out here looking for the Americans. Should you find us, let's rendezvous at this point." But unbeknownst to the Portuguese who received that letter, the second half of the letter was written in invisible ink that only Porter would know how to activate should he actually arrive and take receipt of the letter. And when the invisible ink was activated with heat, it would show Bainbridge's actual directions to Porter. I love that story of espionage in this early era in this far-flung remote place because it provides a sense for us of not only the nature of this sort of duplicitous arrangements in trying to sneak fairly substantial military forces into a section of the world without tipping our hat that that's what we were doing, but also because in this early era without regular radio communications or satellite communications, there was no micromanaging of the fleet. The captains were told, go find the shipping, and they had broad leeway in how and where to do that. And in Bainbridge's case, Porter had already left the Atlantic probably by the time Constitution arrived in Brazil. And he was Porter and Essex had decided it was going to be better hunting in the Pacific and had already rounded Cape Horn and headed off to an entire other ocean. But there was, that still letter is available. That letter too, by the way, is also now in the collection of the museum. So he continues to head down and spies a couple of ships in the neutral port, British ships in the neutral port off Brazil, and there encounters the second big battle that Constitution participates in with a British ship, the HMS Java. Now, unlike Guerriere, which was just a guns against guns battle, the Java turns into a dance of seamanship and sail handling. These two ships approach each other and then are forced to constantly maneuver relative to the wind in order to bring their guns to bear effectively. And you can see them here at the beginning. I love these dance diagrams, by the way. People drew these of all of these battles showing how the ships arrange themselves. They're often a little bit misleading because of the sizes of the icons, but it gives you a sense of the drama unfolding as these ships maneuver relative to each other.
Looks like a front stair dance stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. We literally call them dance. It's like a Fred Astaire dance diagram. That's what we call them at the museum. Yeah, we actually use these two with the current active duty crew to explain how the battles unfolded, and actually have the crew walking them out on the floor of our meeting room. So yeah, it's great to see the crew doing interpretive dances to Constitution battles. At the height of that, though, Java attempts to attack, turning the bow of the ship through the eye of the wind, stalls out, gets stuck in that position. And because of that inability to maneuver is what allows Constitution to really bring guns to bear in a devastating raking broadside that eventually, like it did with Guerriere, brings Java to its knees. First a bowsprit, then a foremast, then a mainmast, and essentially completely dismasted. And again, just like Guerriere, the hull proved in too poor a shape to be towed back across the Atlantic to Boston or New York or any American port. And so there too, Java ends up being scuttled. But Constitution itself comes back to Boston and is once again celebrated, refitted out, and sent out for a third cruise of the War of 1812 under Charles Stewart. And Stewart also heads back out into the Atlantic and finds nothing. Circles around the Caribbean, comes back to Boston, and finds a British squadron, much like Hull had done, finding himself outnumbered off of Marblehead, runs back into Boston, and is stuck there because he's outnumbered by a number of British ships that are blockading the port of Boston for the summer of that year. And finally, at the end of the year, there's an opening, and Constitution gets out and is back out on the open seas and heads across the Atlantic looking for shipping on those main shipping routes. Again, this age of sail, those shipping routes were dictated by the trade winds. And he ends up off of Madeira, where he encounters not one, but two, albeit slightly smaller, British frigates, and takes them on in a 2-on-1 battle. Here again, another amazing effort at seamanship and sail handling. In the midst of this battle, as these two ships line up to aim their guns at Constitution, Constitution's firing back and forth, the wind is light, the sun is going down, evening is approaching. The clouds of thick gun smoke are enveloping the deck, and Stewart calls for them to stop firing because he can't even see what they're shooting at. And so they stop. And slowly the ship moves out of the cloud of smoke. And Stewart realizes that he's about to be surrounded. The second ship is attempting to turn up and cut behind Constitution, which would allow it to deliver a huge raking fire across Constitution's stern, while the other one is attempting to do the same, but across Constitution's bow. And with a swift order, Stewart calls for all the sails to be backed, meaning that the angles of the yards are completely turned around so that the ship continues to sail, but this time sails in reverse and backs back into the cloud of smoke, cutting off the enemy ships that are trying to surround him, and at the same time allowing him on Constitution to develop a devastating raking fire that disables and causes one of the British ships, to surrender. The other one sails off. In a matter of hours, the crew from Constitution takes control of that one British frigate, sends over a prize crew of officers and crew to take the British prisoners and run that vessel, and then sets off in pursuit of the other one. And by the end of the day, 12 hours after they had first sighted each other on the horizon, Constitution has now defeated the second ship and taken it as prisoner again too, and within an hour later was ready to do battle again according to the ship's logbooks. it's an amazing sort of testimony to what we talk about when we talk about seamanship and skill under sail. And it is reverberates again with the American public when Stewart returns back. Yeah.
What's the average height of the men?
The average height of the men? Off the top of my head, I believe it was still about 5'6", I want to say. The idea that people are dramatically shorter is a little bit of a misnomer. We do have ages on a lot, or heights on a lot of them through military service records and muster rolls. We at the USS Constitution Museum, as one of our goals, has been tracking individual crew members of Constitution, both during the War of 1812 as well as before and after. And we've developed an electronic database of 15,000 crew members who have served on Constitution over the last 220 years, including about 1,200 of them who served during the War of 1812. The crew then, as now, were rotating in and out fairly quickly within a year or two. So over the year's period, 3-year period of the War of 1812, they're seeing a couple different crews come in and out. But that third victory, again, is pretty dramatic in terms of causing the nation to really sort of celebrate Constitution. It becomes a symbol of the nation's victories, a symbol of the naval strength of the United States. And she's celebrated all over the place. Souvenirs like this print transfer creamware pitcher made in England, ironically enough, but celebrating this defeat of the British are sold everywhere. My photo seemed to have fallen off the page here on the PowerPoint, but there were songs commemorating Hull's victory, as well as Bainbridge's and Stewart's.
How tall were the men?
About 5'6", yeah.
With the old Ironsides.
What's the reason why?
Nutrition, among other things. Crew were needing a lot of nutrition to get in there and to do the work underway on Navy ships like this. And it wasn't always, it wasn't the horror show of diet that we occasionally read about and hear about. But this is the pre-refrigeration era, right? And so they were eating a lot of salt beef, salted pork. Scurvy was still a significant potential issue. At the museum, as we look at all of these crew members, we've actually gone through and also identified just about everybody who ever died while they were in service on board the vessel. And more than half of them die of unexplained reasons. They wake up not in battle, not from falling overboard, not from falling out of the rig, just a variety of elements. A number of them died from dysentery later on a voyage across the Indian Ocean that I'll talk about here in a second. Constitution after the War of 1812 goes back to the Mediterranean in the 1820s and 1830s, continuing to protect U.S. merchant shipping throughout that ocean. And then in the 1840s, as she is sort of derelict and sitting in a Navy yard and uncertain what's going to happen next to her, the Navy agrees to a plan to sail the ship around the world. And Jack Percival, Mad Jack he was known, Captain Percival takes over, the oldest captain to ever serve at USS Constitution in his 60s when he took command, manages to refit the ship dramatically under budget at the Navy's request, and they begin a circumnavigation of the globe. Unlike her previous voyages where she was either going directly into conflict against enemies or protecting U.S. shipping, this was a much more multifaceted mission that was designed to help develop diplomatic relations and establish trade agreements in some foreign ports, do a wide variety of things. She stops in more than 25 ports over a 2-year period, including stopping at a number of places in Southeast Asia, not the least of which was also the very first time that the ship visits what would eventually become known as Vietnam. there at Cochin China and what is today Da Nang. The ship stopped to conduct a variety of agreements and ended up, because Percival was not particularly dramatic, ended up in what amounted to a diplomatic scuffle over an abducted French bishop there. And at the same time, one of the sailors again died also of illness, not of military conflict, but was buried there in the bay, on the beach in the bay. And it was not until just a couple years ago that that grave completely sort of disappeared. Over the centuries, this sailor's tomb had sort of morphed into becoming a local shrine in which fishermen would leave tokens of good luck for the gods at what had originally been a burial site of a U.S. sailor. They were leaving good luck tokens for their benefit as they went to sea. My understanding recently is that our understanding is that that shrine site was unfortunately plowed over in the construction of a large resort there on the bay now. Yeah.
Excuse me. What did you use for ballast?
A variety. He's asking about ballast in Constitution. Actually, one of Constitution's biggest ballasting are the provisions she's carrying with her to go into battle and to feed the crew. With a crew of about 450 on board and a deployment length that could last up to 6 months at sea, Constitution was carrying more than 47,000 gallons of water down in the hold of the vessel in large, massive tanks that were so large the casks were actually built in place, and then the water with smaller buckets and smaller barrels brought up from the hold. And so everywhere they went, they were looking to refill that, not only because they always needed fresh water for the crew, but because that weight down there was contributing to the stability of the vessel. The other thing that served as the ballast were the cannonballs themselves. She was carrying a gunnery armament and ammunition that would fill all of those guns to about 100 shots per gun, times about 50 guns. So about 5,000 balls ranging between 24 and 32 pounds each. All of that down in the hold of the vessel, contributing to the stability she needed to sail effectively with all those massive sails up aloft. After coming back from this global circumnavigation, she continues to serve the U.S. Abroad. One of her final assignments in active duty was in the West Africa Squadron in the 1850s, when she was responsible for stopping Americans and others in the slave trade out of West Africa. The ownership of slaves may have still been legal until the Civil War, but the importation of people, enslaved people, had already been outlawed, and Constitution's last seizure of the 33 vessels that she seized over her career was an American schooner that was involved in the slave trade. No slaves on board when they found her, but there was obvious evidence that that's what the ship was being used at, and Constitution and her crew took command of that vessel and took it into custody as well too. The Constitution, USS Constitution from the 1850s, then begins a much more diverse sort of array of service, continuing to serve. In the 1860s, during the American Civil War, she is serving as a dormitory, essentially, and receiving hall for Naval Academy cadets, first down in Annapolis, Maryland, and when they evacuate Annapolis because of the threat from the south, she ends up spending the war serving the Naval Academy at its temporary location in Newport, Rhode Island, throughout the war before returning back down there. Then in the 70s is back at work again, and this is the first actual photograph taken of USS Constitution under sail, and ironically, it is probably one of the last times that she was under sail. This is her in the 1880s sailing into Chesapeake, where she eventually was set aside and replaced by the modern Steel Navy. She then ends up in a rather ignominious role as a receiving ship up at the Portsmouth New Hampshire Navy Yard. They literally built a barn over the vessel to make a utility use for it out of there. And by 1890s, as the centennial of the ship is approaching, she's in really horrible condition. And she is, the city of Boston politically lobbies to have her brought back to her home port where she was launched in time for her 100th anniversary. And they do that in 1897. It's still a long road for her to actually get restored and renovated. And because a wooden ship is never expected to last anywhere near this long, those restorations and renovations are constantly ongoing. In 1906, she is heavily restored and brought back to shape after, but only after, the Navy initially said, you know, we can't really afford this. Maybe we'll use her for target practice for the modern Navy. And a Boston resident, Moses Galician, an immigrant, Armenian immigrant, who had made a fortune in the copper trade here in Boston, who had actually been responsible for providing the copper replacements of the Lion and Unicorn that are on the old State House at the head of State Street in Boston, read this in the news and said it was horrible and quickly dashed off a telegram to the Navy and said, all right, I'll buy her for $10,000. And the Secretary of the Navy wrote back and said, thank you, it's not within my power to sell the ship, to which Galician responded, okay, $15,000. Needless to say, the ship did not end up being bought by a private citizen, but the uproar over this prospect that she could be destroyed rallied public support for her to be renovated. And it was at that point that she was restored back, the barn removed, and she was restored back to looking much more like she would and had looked in 1812. And then by the 1920s, she was suffering again and needed yet another sort of rebuild and restoration. And at that point, the Navy called upon the U.S. And American people in general to help contribute to this. There was a pennies campaign conducted in which school children from around the nation gathered and contributed their pennies to help rebuild the ship, raising the money to do that right before the crash of 1929 and the Depression. It's fascinating to think about the contingencies of timing in this. If this reconstruction had occurred just a year or two later, it may not have occurred at all when America was thrust into the Depression. But the construction on this ship began before, and it was completed by the beginning of the 1930s. And so in order to show America what they had helped pay to restore, and also to provide that boost of patriotism and spirit during the height of the Depression, the ship then proceeded to go on a nationwide tour, not under sail, but towed by another Navy ship. And she traveled to U.S. ports from Boston all the way to Florida, around the Gulf Coast, through the Panama Canal, all the way up to Seattle, Washington, and turned around and came back. Millions of people in every port at the height of the Depression came for free to see this Navy ship that their children had helped contribute to the restoration of. The amazing part about this is during that time period, the ship continued to have a regular active duty crew on board. A lot of those sailors ended up in World War II in the Pacific. Afterwards, we are very fortunate at the museum to house in our collection the scrapbooks that these young men kept of this adventure very early on in life as they were aboard old Ironsides for her transit along the American coastline right before World War II. After the war and through the remaining time period of the 1900s and into the 2000s, Constitution has remained at what is now the Charlestown Navy Yard, leaving Boston Harbor only once, and that was in 1997 on the 200th anniversary of the ship's launch. Constitution set sail under her own power again, for the first time since the 1880s, sailed all the way up to Marblehead, Massachusetts, and back again, with a crew that was supplemented by tall ship sailors from a variety of other ships, as well as Coast Guard crew and other Navy crew, and seen by millions both on TV around the nation as well as in Boston.
I brought some pictures that I've saved from 1997 on that.
Oh, there you go.
Marblehead. They're right there.
There you go. One of the people had brought photos from that 1990, additional photos from that 1997 sail. Yeah, it was truly an amazing experience too for everyone involved. A couple years ago, during the 20th anniversary of that sail, the museum hosted a reunion of the crew that had been involved in it, and all of them spoke really eloquently about just how impactful it was for them to be part of this, and for the rest of the nation to see and be part of it as well too. Constitution is still located there. As I suggested at the beginning, she sees about 500,000 people a year. We at the USS Constitution Museum, located right across from them, see a nearly equal number most of the years. Her most recent restoration work, ongoing, occurred from 2015 to 2017. She was out of the water and in dry dock number 1, right next to where she currently docks. This dry dock is maintained and has been since 1833. Even after the Navy Yard shut down to the rest of Navy service, this particular dry dock remains operational specifically for the use by USS Constitution, where we're happy to continue seeing her. And today we see school children, tourists from around the world, active duty service members from all the services of the U.S., as well as veterans that run across generations. And telling that story, that heritage of the U.S. Navy, the story of those people who served there, is part of what we're happy to do still at Constitution.
You can go aboard.
You absolutely can. USS Constitution is open to the public. You will get a tour from a U.S. Navy crew member. It is free to the public and open year-round.
I think it was about a year ago, my daughter and I went down to see, like, I guess it was like a, I can't remember the term of it, but it was like a day where a bunch of different boats were from all different parts of the United States, in the port with it. What is that called?
So there was a Tall Ship Festival in 2017.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's when we got to see it, and it was just spectacular.
So one of the fascinating things about that is that there were these other large sailing ships in Boston Harbor for this massive festival and celebration in 2017. And although many of these ships are larger, longer in length than Constitution, many of them heavier and bigger in tonnage than Constitution, none of them had a sailing rig as large as Constitution's. Because all of these more modern sailing vessels that are still underway today are largely built around the idea of training people. And to train people, you want a lot of things for them to do, but you're not necessarily in a rush to get anywhere, right? So Constitution, however, has a rig and the sails, and the height of that rig above the water still exceeded any of the rest of them that were there. The main driving sails of Constitution, which she set during this 1997, to give you a sense of perspective, the height of that center sail there on the mainmast, the length of that sail from top to bottom is about 55 feet.
Yeah, she looked far larger than the others, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's an astonishing thing. Thank you for coming today. I hope this has been entertaining. I'm happy to answer other questions you may have.
Where did we get the name Old Ironsides?
So where did she get the name Old Ironsides? Her asked, she's not made out of iron. In her very first battle against HMS Guerriere, as they began to exchange gunfire against each other at long range, the British balls were bouncing off of the side of this wooden hull, and the crew shouted out, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron." And that was the idea. That nickname stuck, and it was, while she was not made of iron, she was made of oak, and not just the heavy white oak on the outsides, but a specific type of southern oak that helped form her framing, and the frames inside of the planking are almost as dense and side by side as the planking themselves. Live oak was harvested from the coastal islands off Georgia. It's much denser, much heavier, but helped provide the iron and old Ironsides, if you will. The hull itself is about 18 inches thick of solid oak.
You
Yeah.
mentioned that some of her ballast was the water and some of it was, of course, her ammunition. Did she resupply away from the United States, or was it always just resupplied back to the United States?
With the exception of water and some fresh foodstuffs, yeah, mostly coming back here throughout the 1812 and some of the later ones. Although during the Mediterranean cruises, she established ports and bases in Sicily, Sardinia, and also spent a good degree of time on the island of Malta. In fact, just a few months ago, there was a plaque put up in Malta, in Valletta, in the harbor there, commemorating Constitution's close relationship with Malta, because at the height of that, while they were on patrol in the Mediterranean for that extended time period, they didn't necessarily have the crew they needed to continue doing the work. And so at one point, they actually signed on Maltese nationals as U.S. Navy crew members. And there were more than nearly 24, as I recall, who came on at one particular time for an entire year.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, just the old Errol Flynn movies when it was, you know, a three-mast frigate, you know, how they ran the other one and everybody's going aboard and going. I mean, that's all I can see with Errol Flynn leading them.
Yeah, right, leading the charge. So Captain Blood swinging over. Yeah.
There's another pirate movie too he did.
Yeah, the Seahawk had a leg.
Yeah.
You know, if you were getting into a collision, it was usually not intentional because that threw things. You know, you're far better trying to take command of an enemy vessel through gunfire. But there were very close efforts to, you know, that ended up, collisions that nearly ended up in boardings and other boardings. And practicing for those kinds of boarding activities was a key part of what the Navy training involved during the time period. And it's one of the many activities that today's current active duty crew still train and replicate in that historic fashion of boarding pikes to prevent boarders from coming over the sides. In fact, it was in one of those early battles that as the two ships collided into each other, there was a U.S. Marine standing on the rail, said, "Shall I board?" Turned to ask, "Shall I board?" And as he did so, was shot by a musket, and as a result, became the first U.S. Marine actually to die in battle. Was aboard USS Constitution. William Bush was his name. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
In the current day,
In the current day, does the crew actually furl and unfurl, or unfurl and furl the sails?
Oh yeah, the current command and the upcoming command have been very enthusiastic about training with this current crew, and so they tend to do it early in the morning. If you want to see the crew actually setting and striking sail at the dock, you'll need to be there at about 6:30 in the morning. But they are doing that as part of a sail training program to learn how the ship operates. They'll do it also in conjunction with the new chief petty officers. Constitution hosts about 150 newly designated chief petty officers for a week of sort of heritage training. And they'll be, those new officers will actually sleep on board Constitution, and we'll be working with Constitution's crew in setting and furling sails and rowing small boats and doing a variety of other activities to really sort of immerse them in the history and heritage of the task that they are taking on and the service that they're serving.
So every day this happens?
No. It'll depend on the weather schedules. It's only in the summertime. Right now, the ship is largely down-rigged for the winter time. But yeah, they'll do it fairly regularly in the summer. In addition, they've developed relationships with a couple other currently sailing tall ship replicas, where the crew, groups of the crew are heading out to actually sail ships like Constitution under sail and really get that firsthand experience of doing it. And they do that with the U.S. Coast Guard bark Eagle, as well as with brig Niagara, a replica of an 1812 brig located up on the Great Lakes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's historically right, but it's, when the other ship with Elephant leading the rest of the, the men, all the masts would be shot down, and let's just go get it.
Yeah, this was a profoundly bloody form of battle.
Yeah.
It wasn't the 24-pound cannonball that was going to kill you. It was that wooden hull that it had just blown through that was going to kill you, because as these balls came through that wood, it entered cleanly and then departed the other side in a hail of splinters that could be up to a foot long, and it was deadly fire. The first-hand accounts we have of U.S. Navy sailors who boarded some of these dismantled British ships that you see speak of the carnage and loss of life that occurred. You can imagine, these are masts that are 100 feet tall. The masts themselves can be the diameter of large oak trees, and I tell people, if you think to recent, whatever the latest winter storm was that brought down trees, and you'll see pictures of a, large oak tree collapsed onto someone's house or destroyed a car, and, you look at, oh my gosh, how did that thing snap like that? Imagine a tree like that, only 100 foot tall, attached to sails with crew standing up in it, coming down on top of a floating vessel, and then dragging down over the side of that vessel. The carnage on deck could be really devastating. Yes?
Who was the last person to get killed on the ship?
Who was the last person to actually get killed in fire on board the ship? I don't know that off the top of my head. I believe it would have been in the battle with HMS Cyan and HMS Levant. We have records of the casualties from all of those battles and conflicts, but I could not tell you the last person to die directly from enemy fire on board. We are working with, in terms of the rest of the deaths, there were a couple falling overboard, a couple out of the rig, but again, the vast majority of them are illness. And we have the medical records of the ship's doctors who describe these ailments that they suffered from, but the descriptions don't always match up with modern medicine. And so we're actually working with some doctors with a background in history to say, if this is the set of symptoms that the doctor at the time was describing, what do we think that this sailor really died of? And it's, the wide variety of things that were described as fevers, could be yellow fever, but also malaria. There was dysentery, there was tuberculosis, wide variety of ailments and things that continued to, and scurvy, that continued to afflict the crew over time. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I hope you found this useful. And if you have an opportunity, please come visit USS Constitution and the Constitution Museum.
Thank you so much for that presentation.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it. And that was so informative. There was a lot of information there that I not even thought about. So thank you very much. And thank you for your questions as well. If you have future questions, I'll pass them on if that's okay.
Absolutely.
We just are very grateful for all your time and all that you do every day to help, really protect this history that all of us are involved in. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for your role in protecting those who have protected us.